It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothabus newsroom, filling in for Brian today. Today is the last day of the Supreme Court's term, and as always, they've left the cases that deal with some of the hottest hot-button issues for the very end. Those include President Trump's challenge to birthright citizenship and two cases that examine state bans on transgender athletes playing in women's sports. The opinions are released at 10 a.m., so we've got a producer with eyes on the news. And Yale Law School's Emily Bazelon will be back for our final segment to explain the rulings and what they mean. Plus, later in the show, what the city is doing to keep us safe and healthy during the coming heat wave. New York City Emergency Management Commissioner Christina Farrell will be with us for a quick briefing, and we'll talk especially about how to keep the most vulnerable among us safe in these extreme high temperatures. And Asma Khalid, a familiar voice to many NPR listeners from her time as a White House correspondent, will be my guest to talk about her new BBC series that looks at the way the U.S. has shaped the rest of the world over its 250 years. To start things off today, we're considering the impact of a Supreme Court decision from last week that immediately suspended temporary protected status, or TPS, for more than 350,000 people in this country from Haiti and Syria. TPS has existed for more than 3 decades as a way to provide humanitarian protection from deportation to people whose countries are deemed too dangerous to return to because of political instability, war, natural disasters, and other factors. The Trump administration has moved aggressively to limit those protections. So far, they've already ended TPS for 10 of the 17 countries granted that designation. So what does this ruling mean on the ground in a place like New York, where researchers estimate nearly 40,000 Haitians with TPS live and work in our communities? Joining me now to explain the legal ramifications of this decision is Jessica Bansal, TPS counsel for the National Day Laborer Organizing Network. She served as a counsel for plaintiffs in the U.S. Supreme Court proceedings in Mullin v. Doe, challenging the termination of TPS for Syria. She also represents the National TPS Alliance in litigation challenging the termination of TPS for Haiti, Venezuela, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua. Jessica, welcome to WNYC.
Thank you. Good morning.
And to give us perspective on the impact from right here in New York, we're also joined by Macollvie Neel, Special Projects Editor at the Haitian Times. Macollvie, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks, Bridget. It's good to be with you.
And Jessica, to start things off, let's give our listeners some context. The court issued a 6-3 decision last week. Their ruling stemmed from 2 cases that were argued before them in April. So can you give us the overview of what was being argued and also the role you played?
Yes. So as you said, it was 2 cases involving about 350,000 Haitian TPS holders and about 7,000 Syrian TPS holders. But the question was really a broad one that affects all TPS litigation. And it was, does the court have authority to stop an illegal TPS termination? No one in the opinion claims that the administration has been following the rules about TPS. They very clearly are acting illegally. But what the court said, that 6-3 majority, is that it doesn't matter, that courts don't have the power to stop an illegal termination, don't have authority to review the kinds of statutory claims that the plaintiffs had raised in that case. They said maybe a constitutional claim, it can be reviewed, but they found, which I think, you might have to be a lawyer to work your mind around how you could find this, but they found that the statements that President Trump has made about Haitians are not racist. They're actually policy statements. So when he said, for example, that Haitians are poisoning the blood of this country, that was a policy statement.
Wow. So we'll just to put a fine point on that, Jessica, I mean, one of the issues that was raised in the Haiti case was constitutional concerns over whether the TPS termination was racially motivated. because of statements like that. I think people often also think about comments he made about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs, completely unfounded and, certainly, found to be racist by many people who heard them. Can you explain what the arguments were for that dimension of the case and why the court rejected those claims?
The court said, which is a real sort of divergence from normal equal protection jurisprudence, that because there was a non-racist reason also provided for ending TPS, in this case that President Trump has made ending temporary protected status program a goal because he doesn't want immigrants to have that protection, that's a non-racist reason. And so and also the immigration context in which all these statements were made should sort of lessen the normal way you would look at a statement like that, and led the court to the conclusion that, these statements that I think the dissent really powerfully calls out as very standard racist tropes about filth and disease and criminality, that such statements are not racist. I'm struggling to explain it because I really think for a layperson, it's sort of obvious. And so what the court did is actually the majority did not mention the statements. I mean, they don't quote any of the statements, and they just give a sanitized version of what happened and then conclude that it wasn't racist.
I mean, Jessica, it is hard to wrap the mind around how one could hear so many of those comments and hear them as policy statements. But from a powers point of view, was some of what the court was, this conservative majority deciding, simply around expanding the powers of the presidency and what the role of the president has when it comes to determining, who is legally able to be in this country?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the sort of normal presumption is if Congress makes a law, as it did when it created the Temporary Protected Status Program, and sets up certain rules for the government to follow, that if the government violates those rules, a court can review it. That's the normal presumption. And so by sort of turning that on its head and reading the statute instead really, really broadly to prevent the courts from considering even whether former Secretary Noem followed the rules, that greatly expands the power of the Department of Homeland Security when it comes to this humanitarian program that was actually designed to restrain the Department of Homeland Security's discretion.
Macollvie, I want to bring you into this conversation because you wrote a really, I think, for listeners who are looking to get some of those basic questions answered about, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to my friends and neighbors? A really helpful Q&A about this decision for the Haitian Times. And you noted that the Trump administration had actually already ended TPS for Haiti with an end date anticipated for last February, but lower courts had blocked that move. So how did the lawyers you spoke with explain this latest ruling?
So, Bridget, this is something that, honestly, the community has kind of seen coming, and the lawyers and advocates we spoke with weren't that surprised. They were very disappointed, right? But given the line of questioning during the oral arguments, they weren't as shocked as you would expect that the court's ruling removes the postponement that the district judge in DC had put in place for that initial revocation on February 3rd. So a lot of what they've been focusing on is the legislative route at this point, where they're really pushing people to call their senators, call other members of Congress to get them to pass this bill in the Senate that would extend protections for 3 years for Haitians, right? Their concern right now is to find a way to make temporary protected status not temporary anymore, right? They're really pushing for a path to citizenship for permanent residency for a lot of the people who've been relying on TPS to live and work. And so this bill, S 4814, is what we've seen a lot of them just trying to tell the community, and outside of the community, right? Because we need Haitian people who are not Haitians to actually engage in this, particularly folks who are in Republican-led states, is what they've been saying,
Mm,
to try to join on this bill so it has bipartisan support to get through the Senate.
mm.
So that's where the focus is, obviously, in addition to responding to the critical needs and questions that people are getting about how they might continue to live their day-to-day lives.
Sure. Listeners, if you're just joining us, this is the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. We're talking about the Supreme Court's decision last week to allow President Trump to end TPS protections for more than 350,000 Haitians and a smaller number of Syrians. And we'd like your help reporting this story. Are you a Haitian New Yorker who has been living and working here with TPS? What prompted you to come to New York, and what do you do? And how are you responding to this latest court decision? Are you a Syrian New Yorker, or are you from another country with a TPS designation that has or will expire later this year? We want to hear from you. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Maybe you live or work somewhere where you are seeing the impact of this decision in your community. How is this changing the world around you? Do you live in Little Haiti in Brooklyn? What was it like there when the decision came down? Or do you have a question for either of my guests, attorney Jessica Bansal, TPS counsel for the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, and Macollvie Neel, special projects editor at the Haitian Times. Again, the number's 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Macollvie, I want to go back to some of the reporting that you have been doing, and what kinds of concerns are you hearing on the ground about what this decision means for how people, as you said, can go about their daily lives? Particularly within the Haitian community, how are people with TPS changing their daily routines?
Yeah, a lot of the immediate concern is around employment, right? A lot of people were asking, can I still go to work? Is my work authorization that's tied to TPS still valid? Some people had gotten notices from their employers that they should not return to work as of July 1st, which is tomorrow.
Mm,
In some cases, not just in Brooklyn and New York, but different places around the country, employers have made these different decisions, right? And so when word gets out that some people are getting notices not to come back on a certain day, that just creates more anxiety and churn, and people are just calling and asking service organizations and their lawyers, can I still go to work? Is deportation going to start right away? What should I do with my kids, right? Can I still travel and go to different places? So it really just has this sort of like domino effect on decisions people have to make every day, from leaving their house, right? In certain areas and
sure.
not really knowing whether they'll be met with, agents or whatnot, to continuing to drop off their kids at daycare or going into their jobs. We've seen just the quality of life changes are also coming into effect. One of our reporters in Ohio and Columbus reported to us today that this one gym that's become a gathering spot for a lot of Haitians in that community was just completely empty over the weekend,
Wow.
because people are just, they don't know, right? So on top of the immediate day-to-day piece, there's the need to save as much money as you can, right? So spending on things that might seem unnecessary, like going to the gym, is taking a hit, right?
Mm,
People are just kind of on pause, if you will, until they can get some clear answers about what it means for them as individuals, because each family has a specific individual case that needs to still work through the immigration system.
sure.
And go ahead.
No, finish your thought, please.
Oh, in some cases, that might mean people who are TPS holders now may be waiting for their asylum case that they had applied for to come through to completion, right? Others may be waiting for some other type of immigration relief. So the other thing that's become a topic of conversation is how to make sure everyone who might lose these TPS protections still have the support from the immigration, experts to help them through the other types of immigration relief they might be eligible for or that are still pending.
Sure. Jessica, there is a smaller population of Syrians with TPS in this country who are also impacted by this ruling. Could you talk a bit about what prompted the TPS designation in that case, and what it means for people facing potential deportation to that country?
Yeah, so the TPS designation for Syria began in 2012 in the midst of the devastating civil war. And while conditions have changed, they remain extremely dangerous. If you go on the State Department website and check their travel advisory for Syria, it says, do not go there. It is not safe. And so now these Syrian TPS holders, including doctors, people from all walks of life, who have been living here lawfully for 13 years, in many cases have U.S. citizen children, and unfortunately in many cases also have no path to stay here legally, are faced with, on 60 days notice, actually is what they've been giving all these TPS holders, the decision to uproot their lives and their children, or separate from their children. I mean, it's really devastating for folks, in addition, of course, to losing the work authorization, right? Like TPS holders participate in the labor force at very high rates, like 90%. And so when people lose their work authorization, they lose their income. Many are, homeowners. Again, like a wide diversity of people have been protected by this program. So what we're seeing is, we've been referring to it as like a de-documentation. We have people who are moving from having lawful immigration status to becoming undocumented. And that changes your life in a lot of ways, right? It makes it much harder for you to work, especially jobs where your labor rights are protected. And it exposes you to the risk of detention and deportation. And that's really devastating for people. It's not something that has happened in modern U.S. history, that 1 million people have been stripped of status in this way. And so we don't really know, what will happen. But we hear from our clients about how devastating it's been for their lives.
We have a listener who texted a question, which is, what other countries have TPS, and how do your guests understand why those other countries haven't been targeted? Jessica, would you say that that's accurate, that those other countries haven't been targeted? Or, from your perspective, the Trump administration seems to be taking a pretty sweeping approach to targeting TPS in general.
Yes. So there are 3 countries that still have TPS, four countries. There are Lebanon, El Salvador, Ukraine, and Sudan. For 3 of those countries, they just haven't come up for a decision yet. Each country is on its own timeline. And so every single country that has come up for a decision and the administration has actually gone through the process and decided what to do, they have terminated. Lebanon still has TPS because they made no decision. So far it's 13 countries up for decision and they've all been terminated. The decision about El Salvador will come by September, and Ukraine and Sudan will come by October. And so, obviously no one knows for sure what will happen. But part of one of the claims in the case before the Supreme Court was that there's not a real review going on at the Department of Homeland Security. The normal way TPS works is that when a country comes up for decision, the Homeland Security consults with the State Department about what the conditions are in that country, and they make a decision based on conditions. Instead, what we're seeing is there's basically orders from above that we're ending this program. And so they're sort of reverse engineering the decisions. They decide to terminate, and then they research any improvements they could say. So, for example, for Afghanistan, you can read their decision, and they say, well, there's a lot of tourism in Afghanistan. Things are fine in Afghanistan. And that decision is not flow from objective research. That decision flows from they decided to terminate. And the documents we got through the litigation, in our case, in our Venezuela case, show the way they did their research was personnel were instructed to just find little gems, little positive improvements that they could cite. It wasn't find out what the conditions in the country were. So, if they continue that, if nothing changes, it is very likely they're going to terminate all the countries.
Listeners, Macollvie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to add that this is the exact question a lot of Haitians, are asking is if Haitians don't deserve to be part of the TPS program anymore, then how are they going to return to Haiti when the State Department has a level 4 travel warning for people for Haiti, meaning that they've told American citizens and other folks not to go there or travel there because it's too dangerous, right? When we have an airport in a capital that's shut down by the FAA because it's deemed so unsafe, how are you sending people there? Like, what are they going to go back home to? So this idea of the Department of Homeland Security making these decisions just at the pleasure of the president and others, and then kind of like moving backwards to find reasons to make it plausible, that fits into what Jessica was saying earlier, that they made the decision and now they're trying to walk back to find reasons via the State Department to say it's okay for Haitians to be deported there if that's what that comes to. And so people here just it doesn't make sense for it to be too dangerous to travel on the one hand for American citizens and other folks, but not dangerous enough to send thousands of people back to homes that, may not exist anymore.
Sure. Listeners, we'd love your help reporting this incredibly sensitive story. Whether you are impacted directly because you live and work here with TPS or because you have friends or neighbors or family who are struggling with the fallout of this decision. We'd love to hear from you, or if you have questions for my guests. Jessica Bansal, TPS counsel for the National Day Labor Organizing Network, or Macollvie Neel, special projects editor at the Haitian Times. Your calls and texts are welcome. The number is 212-433-9692. That's 212-433-9692. We need to take a short break, but much more with my guests and your calls and texts coming up. Stick around. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today. We're talking about last week's 6-3 court ruling ending TPS for Haitians and Syrians in this country and what it means going forward. My guests are attorney Jessica Bansal, TPS counsel for the National Day Labor Organizing Network, and Macollvie Neel, special projects editor at the Haitian Times. Macollvie, I mentioned your Q&A about this decision posted at the Haitian Times, and you started to talk a little bit about, some of the other immigration concerns that people may have, like people who are waiting on asylum claims or even people who are of Haitian descent but who were born in this country. How does last week's decision affect people in those situations?
So we have different groups across our community, right? There are about 1.2 million to 1.5 million Haitians in this country. And, most of us are permanent residents or citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first question is, not every to answer one question that has come up is, does this mean Haitian citizens, naturalized citizens are affected, right? Like it doesn't. This is for the segment of our population that has been granted TPS over the past 15 years or so for different reasons. That includes people who did come in through the southern border over the past 4 or 5 years, certainly, but a very large portion of even that group of TPS holders are people who've been living in the country for more than 10 years, since before the earthquake that triggered TPS for Haiti, right? These are
Mm.
people who had been undocumented or fell out of status for one reason or another and had, for, lack of a better word, been living in the shadows for a long time, right? So TPS offered them an opportunity to become legal and to continue to live and work. And a lot of those people are folks who have had families over the past decades, right? Who've bought homes, who've gotten degrees, all kinds of advanced degrees, and who are really doing well and well on their way to living the American dream. So people in that situation have a different set of concerns when it comes to, protecting their assets that they've accumulated, their children certainly, right?
Sure.
And just leaving their communities and neighbors and churches and all of the the way that we associate with everyday life. That's one concern. There are, you know, another group of people who I said are recent arrivals, right, who
Mm-hmm.
came into the border. They're very concerned about what is next for them. They've barely had a chance to make a life here, right? Although a lot of them have done very well for themselves in the short time that they've been here. So when you think about communities like, Springfield, Charleroi, who've helped revitalize these American cities, right? Who've gone in and filled in warehouse jobs, meat factory jobs, certainly the home health aid jobs. We hear talk about these folks now are just getting on their way and trying to find ways to go to school and get their degrees, right? Attain additional education certifications and whatnot. Those decisions now have to be put on pause because they're not sure whether they'll even have access to further education and to take on other jobs, right?
Mm.
People who've been offered promotions at their jobs have had to decline them because getting into a new job potentially might mean reviewing their immigration status and having an employer say, oh, you're out of status now, and just triggering a whole new set of issues for them. And then you have folks who are U.S. citizens and permanent residents who might feel a little distant from this latest immigration TPS ruling, right?
Sure.
But who still go to the same churches, in our communities, who still frequent the same restaurants and barber shops and, TikTok communities and all of that, right? Those folks may not be immediately affected in the sense that they won't be able to live and work without fear of detention, but they still have to help our community deal with the stress, the anxiety of all of this, right? We have to step into the gap of making sure they have correct information to counter a lot of the disinformation or misinformation that's running rampant on social media
Yeah.
in many places. We have to help them make sure they have access to an emergency plan that might involve tasks as detailed as, if I am detained for some reason, which US citizen can I trust to pick up my child for me if I can't pick up my child from school? Or whose number should I give to my child's school to call if for some reason I'm caught up in some immigration action having to do with detention?
Sure.
So different segments of the population have different concerns. It affects us all, but just in different
Yeah.
ways. Um,
Jessica, the Trump administration has been making the argument that TPS, temporary protected status, is always supposed to be temporary. I want to play a clip from Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin on CNN with Jake Tapper this past weekend.
The status itself can be ended in its name itself by saying temporary. So these individuals have a couple of choices. They can try to apply for a permanent residence here. They can apply for a temporary visa if they choose to, or they can choose to go back. And if they want to go back, we'll help them with that. If I'm talking directly to the individuals with the temporary protected status, either try to fill out the paperwork and be here underneath a permanent status, or we'll help you get back to your country. We'll actually give you a plane ticket plus roughly $2,100 to help you reestablish when you get there. But temporary protected status, according to the courts and in its name itself, is not permanent status.
So, Jessica, I mean, we've talked about the just fundamental disconnect with the safety concerns in so many of these places, these countries that we're talking about, Haiti and Syria specifically. What is your response to hearing Mullin's argument there? And, is there any likelihood that people with TPS would be able to secure permanent status?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have two responses, a legal response and a sort of human response. The legal response is that this program is called temporary protected status, and it's temporary in that every 18 months for the past, in some cases, 2.5 decades, there are countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Somalia, that have been designated for even longer than Haiti and Syria. Administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have reviewed conditions and have actually faithfully applied the rules Congress made and have concluded that it's not safe to go back. It takes a lot of time to recover from some of the crises that these countries are dealing with. And Congress actually made extending TPS the default. So unless you affirmatively can find it safe to go back, the law says extend. And even if you disagree with that, at this point, it has been decades. Again, administrations from both parties have extended these protections. And so the question is, what happens to these folks now? And that sort of brings me to the human response, which my clients can convey a lot better than I can. But what they've said to me is our lives are not temporary. It's not like people have been here like in some state of suspended animation, waiting on all life decisions for 10, 15, 20 years. People have married, they have had U.S. citizen children, they have built careers, and now they have very deep roots in this country. And tearing out those roots is devastating for each individual, and there's no benefit to anyone. I mean, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for our community. And so the human sort of response is, why would you do this to these people? The last thing I'll say is that TPS holders are very smart. They know about paperwork. If you have TPS, you have filled out incredibly extensive applications at least, 5, 10, some cases 15 times regularly. You know how to fill out paperwork. People don't have some other status because they chose not to apply. People don't have some other status because our immigration laws do not provide people a path to get permanent residence in many, many cases.
I want to bring in some of our callers. Let's go to Neil in Wilton, Connecticut. Neil, you're on WNYC.
Hi. I want to thank you for doing this today. And I just want to, there's a way sometimes that the human side of this story drops out. And what's powerfully being presented here is that story. And that story is a mother who is going to an attorney's office to sign away her children. That story is a family separation story of a caregiver, right, who is a caregiver for a child or a caregiver for a senior who, if they are forced to leave, that will be trauma for an entire family system, in addition to the TPS folks. Immigration in this country has always been a moving target, and I'm a Jew. My family I would not be here speaking to you without an immigration system that was humane. So what I'm hoping is that, as Brad Lander said on these airwaves last week, sometimes it requires people whose skin color is different than those being targeted to put their bodies on the line. Sometimes this means that we have to use our dollars and our voices to speak for people at this point who are sometimes afraid to speak. So I hope that the program will also bring on ideas for, how we can all contribute in whatever way we can.
Neel, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Taylor in Queens. Taylor, you're on WNYC.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. The two questions that I was having with this TPS program, one was, I came to the U.S. in 1981, 45 years ago. Back then, immigration was much different nowadays. My parents petitioned me, I think sometime in December of 80, and by April of 81, like a few months later, I had my green card over there. And then I flew into these states. There was no TPS program in the 1980s. I'd like to find out, how did it start? Was it an act of Congress? Was it an executive action? Was it a lawsuit? What was it that triggered the initial TPS? How did it came about?
Taylor, thank you. Go ahead. What's your second question?
Right. And the second question is, so let us pretend now, let us say that we hit a roadblock and TPS is no more. It ended. Like they said, it's meant to be temporary. Now, what will be the new TPS 2.0? Can someone throw a lifeline and say, you know what, let's we used to have carburetors in automobiles, now we have fuel injectors. A legal mind or someone will say, what if we throw this, and here we go. This is the new equivalent of TPS. It's not called TPS, but it behaves like that.
Sure.
Would it be through another act of Congress? Would it be a new lawsuit about something that we cannot think of at this time?
Taylor, thank you for both of those questions. Jessica, before I'll ask you to take them on, both the start of TPS and Macollvie. I know that you had talked a bit about pending legislation, but before we do that, I want to update our listeners with some breaking news from the Supreme Court. The court has struck down Trump's executive order, so they have upheld birthright citizenship. There's some other decisions that have been issued that we will talk further about later this hour with my guest, Emily Bansal. But big news out of the Supreme Court this morning, much more to talk about later. Jessica, if you want to respond or react to that decision before you answer Taylor's questions, please feel free. But the news from the Supreme Court so far this morning is that they have upheld birthright citizenship. So, Jessica, to you, questions from Taylor and any response you want to have to that.
Yeah, I mean, I have not obviously yet read the, 193-page opinion, but I see the result, which is Chief Justice Roberts writing an opinion joined by the traditional three justices referred to as the liberal justices and Justice Barrett, upholding birthright citizenship. And I think obviously that is a tremendous relief. It almost shouldn't be, because the question is so obvious. But, a contrary result would have been incredibly destabilizing to our country and would have deprived many millions of people of their right to participate fully in the civil rights of the country. So I'm very glad to see that. To return to the TPS questions, Congress created TPS in 1990. It was actually as the result of organizing by Salvadoran immigrants who were repeatedly denied humanitarian protections and sort of what they felt was like a biased decision. The U.S. was supporting a government that was conducting a war, and so it was very hard for Salvadorans to prove persecution because the State Department didn't want to say the government they were supporting was persecuting people. And so they were without any protection, and they organized and they lobbied Congress to create this program that was also supposed to fill a gap in our humanitarian laws where an individual can get protection through asylum if they're going to be targeted. But if you have a situation where it's just unsafe for anyone, there wasn't any formal protection. So one of the things they said on the floor of Congress was, being hit by a stray bullet is just as much of a problem as being, targeted. And so we need to protect people who are just have this kind of crisis in their country that it's not safe for anyone. So they created the TPS program. And I certainly agree that, it shouldn't need to be updated because Congress already wrote down the rules, but Congress can solve the problem the Supreme Court made and can clarify that courts should stop terminations when the secretary doesn't follow the rules. And more importantly, like we were discussing earlier, create a path to permanent status for folks who have been here contributing to our community for so long.
And Macollvie, the second of Taylor's questions about, what could be, I think he described it as the fuel injector for TPS as opposed to the carburetor that was currently TPS. You had talked about some potential legislation.
Right. So this is what we've seen Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley pass this bill through the House of Representatives, H.R. 1689, that would extend the same work authorization, protections for Haitians through a bill, right? Through an act of Congress. So that passed the House a few months ago, and it's now in the Senate to pass. We saw Senator Markey, sponsor it. Senator Schumer says he's ready to evoke some rule, some procedural rule, to try to get it voted on so it could land on the president's desk, right? So this bill would do essentially what TPS does, but instead of the 18 months renewal that people have had to go through every time, this would be 3 years, right? Not clear what happens after those 3 years, if it becomes enshrined, forever. But at this point, it seems like the strategy is to try to get it on the president's desk. It is a midterm year, right? And the chatter we're hearing is that a lot of business people, entrepreneurs, folks who really rely on TPS holders as part of the labor force and as consumers, right? We're talking about $6 billion is the number that Forward US has said TPS holders pump into the US economy. So a lot of businesses just would not want to see TPS holders not be able to work or live their lives, and continue to generate, revenue across the economy.
Sure.
So once that's part of the calculus for getting it on the president's desk in hopes of having the public see that something many sectors, many people across the country want to see happen and retained, to give them that choice to say no to all of those people who want TPS holders to stay and continue to live their lives,
Right.
and weigh that against, his promise to enact this mass deportation that he promised his
Sure.
base would happen. So that's where we are with that bill. But if it passes, that would sort of be the carburetor, I guess.
I know that automotive metaphor was great, despite my very limited knowledge of
if you know
automotive
cars.
mechanics. Yeah. I want to thank both of my guests today, attorney Jessica Bansal, TPS counsel for the National Day Labor Organizing Network. She served as counsel for plaintiffs in the U.S. Supreme Court proceedings in Mullin v. Doe, challenging the termination of TPS for Syria. She also represents the National TPS Alliance in litigation challenging the termination of TPS for Haiti, Venezuela, Honduras, Nepal, and Nicaragua. And Macollvie Neel, Special Projects Editor at the Haitian Times. Many thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget.